Good morning, evening, or afternoon, depending upon when you are or where you are watching our session. This is a continuing series in our series on the Security Plus certification. We're going over all the different topics covered in the Security Plus, the latest edition of it. Robert is not going to join us today. He's off training classes in a live classroom, so he's not available this week, but he'll be joining us again next week for our session next week. Also want to thank Ryan for putting together the slides for us. Just a couple housekeeping important things to remember. If you have any questions during the live event, go ahead and fill them out in the feedback from the audience. So go ahead and just put in any questions that you have. After the session, you can go to our website, learnsecurity.org, and you can any questions, comments that you had on it, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Also, if you could please rate this session in BrightTalk, and when we're done, remember BrightTalk keeps track of how long you're in here, so if you need it for CPE credit, you can log into your account and you can see how long you've been in the session, and it keeps track of how long you've watched. So if you only watch 5 minutes of it, it'll say that you only watch 5 minutes of it. So good for you if you want it for CPE credits. Also, if you want to download the slides, they're available here in the attachments and links. And if you want to see more of this sessions or future sessions, go ahead and follow us, and you'll be informed of any upcoming and new sessions we're going to do. Just a heads up, we're going to continue on with our series on Azure next week. In the following week or the week after that, we're going to follow up with a session specifically on ransomware, update on ransomware, and what you can do to protect your organization from that. So look for those two coming up, and then of course we will continue on the Security Plus going forward. So today we're on Objective 1.5. We're almost done with the Objective 1 section. There's one more objective after this. This one we're going to talk about vulnerability scanning, the concepts behind vulnerability scanning. We talked about pen testing last session, so if you missed that, you can go back and watch it in past sessions already recorded and available. I'm going to talk a little bit about pen testing again here because there's a lot of people have confusion between what is pen testing and what is vulnerability scanning and how they're different. I have clients all the time call me up and say, hey, I want a pen test, and they really want a vulnerability scan, or they call me and say they want a vulnerability scan, and what they really want is a pen test. So if you're going to be a practitioner in cybersecurity, you're going to need to know what the differences are so that you can meet the needs of your organization or organization that you're working for if you're helping them try to uncover vulnerabilities. And so I think the thing to talk about first is just to kind of clear the air. What's the difference between a pen test and vulnerability scan? Well, a scan is going to be, a vulnerability scan is going to be one that goes through and looks for any vulnerabilities, whether they can be exploited or not. It's just looking for weaknesses in a system. You can run a scan against an operating system. You can run it against a web application. You can run it against an application or a database. So you can run it against it. It's going to look for common flaws that those types of systems have. Now that means that whoever's running the vulnerability scan, whatever tool you're using, there's plenty of tools available out there to use. Those tools are going to have to be looked at in the IP addresses that they're scanning to kind of what we call, one, fingerprint them first. In other words, figure out what their identity is, what kind of applications are running it, what ports are open, what operating systems are running on it. And then it's going to run tests to find out if any of those ports are open, have any services running on them, what services are running on them. And it's going to go through that looking for vulnerabilities. It may look for misconfigurations and other types of things with that. At the end of that, this tool or the system that you're using is going to create a report and tell you, and a good one will tell you, hey, this is all the vulnerabilities we've had, here's the IP address, this is how severe that vulnerability is. If you have this vulnerability, there may be exploits that are available or known that people can exploit to do that, and here's a prioritized list of things to fix. Typically, that's what most of them will do, something along those lines. Now, a pen test is different in that you do the exact same stuff as you do with the vulnerability, but then you go a step further and you try to break into the system. So the pen test takes it one step further than the vulnerability scan. So a vulnerability scan is just kind of looking for all the vulnerabilities that a system has. whereas a pen test is just trying to see that it can actually break into your system. One of the things we talked about last time about pen tests is they're not going to look at every vulnerability. They're just looking to see that they can get in. So there's a different goal there. Part of a pen test is also to test your company's or your organization's ability to respond and notice that someone is trying to break into your system. So we call that red team, blue team typically, and that is where your incident responders typically don't know that they're being scanned or they're trying to be penetrated, and we want to test their abilities to actually catch someone trying to get into the system. We don't do that with vulnerability scans. Vulnerability scans, typically everybody knows that the scan's happening. We make sure that our any intrusion detection or intrusion prevention services are whitelisted so that the scan can actually go in and not be interfered with, because we want to know exactly what our vulnerabilities are. We don't want anything interfering or obscuring that, because that means that there is a known vulnerability, there may be a vulnerability there that is hidden, and because it's hidden, we can't find it. And because we can't find it, we didn't patch it. Because we didn't patch it, then it's still a vulnerability. It still exposes us to the potential of someone breaking into our system. And think about it this way: if your intrusion detection system prevents people from, or your organization or pen testers from seeing a system or a vulnerability that actually exists, what happens if that intrusion detection system or intrusion prevention system fails? Then it leaves that vulnerability exposed and hackers can get into it. So again, pen testing has some weaknesses, and vulnerability scanning it has some weaknesses too. We're testing different things, not necessarily that they have weakness, but there's not one that kind of does everything for both. So just remember that. And a little bit more about pen testing. Just remember from last time, we're just trying to circumvent the system to see that the system can actually be circumvented. And act like it's a real-world attack and see how incident responders respond to it. So the idea with a pen test is it's a little bit more interactive. It's like a war game that you're actually playing, whereas a vulnerability scan is, it's just like an audit type of thing where someone's coming through and doing an assessment, looking at your devices and seeing if there is any vulnerabilities that we might find. Generally, I always recommend that you do a vulnerability scan first, make sure you clean everything up, and then have a pen test. It's no use having a pen test before you've had a vulnerability scan, because you're probably not going to pass. Anyways, so one of the things I like to put in here also is there are requirements. And now this isn't on the exam. You don't need to know this for the exam, but it's kind of an important thing to understand that in the industry, whether you are a private organization or a government agency or whatever, there are requirements for doing pen testing. There are requirements for doing vulnerability scans. At the very least, vulnerability scans are required by just about every standard that's out there. Pen testing is not necessarily required for all systems. It just depends. One of them that it is oftentimes required for, and rather excessively, I think sometimes, is PCI DSS. They require anytime you change the network configuration, you need to do a pen test to verify that that system cannot be circumvented. So that's just one of the tests that they require. And here's all the requirements that they have in PCI DSS and the sections. You can actually go look up the requirements. They want you, if you have network segmentation, you need to do a pen test to validate that that network segmentation actually works and that people can't segment or circumvent that network segmentation. So if you set up VLANs to put your credit card processing network on a separate VLAN, you need to do a pen test on that to verify it. You need to also do one externally to make sure someone can't break into your system or get past your firewall. So, and you need to do that at least annually, and then anytime you make a significant change to the network. So it's quite often that you can end up doing this depending upon how often you're updating your network or changing the configuration of your network. They're not necessarily saying that you have to, every time you patch a firewall or something like that, that you have to go in and do a pen test. But they would say if you're changing the firewall rules, that you would need to go in and do a pen test. Or if you're doing a major reconfiguration or changing the VLAN setup within your network, you may have to do it again. Again, these are just some of the times. NIST has, in revision 5, which is still in draft, it's not out yet, they do talk about specialized assessments. So That's just whatever could be out there. That could be a pen test. It could be a vulnerability scan. It's a one-off assessment. Maybe you're looking at a very particular machine. You're not doing an entire network. A good example of this is I had a client that was implementing a utility billing system, and so we did a specialized assessment where we went in there before it went live to test to make sure that it was configured correctly, and in addition to that, do some vulnerability scans against the application just to see if it had any SQL injection errors or was it storing data it wasn't supposed to be. And that assessment actually found out that they were storing credit card information, or it was set to store credit card information when it wasn't supposed to be. So that type of assessment actually helped. And we used a combination of a pen test, a light pen test, and a vulnerability scan to test that. Part of it, we want to validate vulnerabilities, determine that they actually are there. And we also want to make sure that when we're doing some of these types of things, like we're doing a pen test, that they can be an independent team, may be a requirement. Again, all of these are not required for all systems. In NIST 853, especially in the new revision, there's different baselines, low, moderate, high, but then you can also tailor those baselines for each organization. So you may not have this, but the pen testing stuff is listed here, where you may have red team exercise, and they actually have separately called out is facility penetration testing, which we talked a little bit before on that. So vulnerability scanning, again, just to redefine it, a technique used to identify hosts and host attributes and see what vulnerabilities they have. And vulnerabilities can be anything from a configuration issue to an actual vulnerability in the application itself or the code. So when we're looking for those types of things, we're looking for different things. It's not just vulnerabilities particularly. Sometimes it's configurations. For example, we may run a scan and it says you're using SMB version 1, 2, and 3, and you really shouldn't be using version 1, so that's a vulnerability. Well, that's a configuration. That's not necessary. That protocol or that service is just inherently weak, and it's been replaced with newer versions of it. Same thing happens with SSL. The older versions of SSL are weak and can easily be broken, so you want to be using the latest version of TLS. So that's more of usually just a configuration. You just turn off the ability of the system to respond to the older versions of SSL or the SMB version, and you make it so that it works only with the newer versions of it. Typically, these are automated scans. It's too labor-intensive for people to go around to each machine to try and find the vulnerabilities that are on it. We can also use the vulnerability scan to kind of do an inventory, because typically what we do is we sweep the entire IP range. And when we do the entire IP range, we are able to find different devices, and sometimes devices we didn't know were on the network. Oftentimes IoT devices may pop up. Maybe there's a new camera that shows up or something on the network and we didn't know it, so then we can update our inventory. So it can help our inventory process as well. It can test our inventory process and also do the vulnerabilities. One thing that's really interesting about that, though, is what about transient devices? And when I say transient devices, I mean devices that are not always present on your network, and they may not be present when you're running the scan. Most folks, when they run internal scans on a network, they run it at night after hours. Well, that means that organizations or employees may turn off devices that would normally be left on during the day, during the business time. And so when you run your scans, you're missing actual devices that may have vulnerabilities. A good example of that is like a conference room organizing device, like an IoT device that controls your conference room. Maybe the TV that's in the conference room or the sound system that's in the conference room. All those items are connected on a network. If they're not on during the time that you run the scan, they get missed, and I call them transient devices. Maybe you have mobile devices like tablets and projectors that may be on the network. I mean, all kinds of things can be on. When we talk about IoT, there's so many different things that could possibly be on that when we run the scan, we miss those because they're turned off during non-business hours, and we typically run our vulnerability scans during those times. So it doesn't always help us with the inventory. We can't assume that our inventory is perfect with this type of tool, but it is a good way to kind of find where there may be some items missing out of the inventory. There's other tools you might want to use for that. Now, PCI DSS, again, I told you what the requirements were for the pen testing side, but now on the scanning side, you have to have a process to identify any security vulnerabilities that organizations have. You have to identify what the risk is of those vulnerabilities. Again, if you have a scanning tool that does all these things for you, it will rate those vulnerabilities based upon what those vulnerabilities could lead to potentially. What's the impact of those vulnerabilities? You have to look at web applications, especially web applications that have been custom developed by your organization, as opposed to like consumer over-the-counter type of products or applications that you buy that way. You need to do internal and external scanning. Internal scanning is, I think people do it, usually I think the guideline is like quarterly or monthly. But external scanning needs to be done at least monthly, and then you should be doing it anytime there's a change to the network. So if you make a change to the network, you should run a scan just right after, just as a habit of that. Or quarterly and after any significant changes, internal scans by qualified professionals. So PCI wants to make sure that people that are running the scans know how the scans work, right? And if you're doing external scans for compliance reasons, then you need to have them done by PCI ASV, approved scanning vendor. And then you rescan as needed until you basically have no vulnerabilities above a certain threshold. That's what's required for PCI. So they actually have a very robust vulnerability management requirement in their standards. So it's worth checking that out. Also, going back to NIST 853, another control catalog, we can look at it. It has different requirements, whether it's a low, moderate, or high system. So you can kind of see that if it's a low system, you're required to do 5 and 5.2, which is scan for vulnerabilities and update vulnerabilities. So those are two things if you had a low-based system. If you have a moderate-based system, you have to add on 5, which is privileged access and authentication scan. So doing a scan that has privileged access and is being an authenticated scan, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And then if it's a high system, you have to add on to it 4 also, which is what can be discovered about a system. So what can you scan and discover about a system? Beyond the fingerprint, what are you able to figure out? Can you figure out what applications are on or what type of data is on it? Now you see that revision 5 actually has some other items that are not in the low, moderate, or high baseline. So if your system is a high system, you technically don't have to do these things, but they have them in there so that you can take a look at them and maybe possibly add them onto your control environment if the risk is warranted. So if you feel like you have more risks for vulnerabilities, you may want to do automated trend analysis. So look, is over time your vulnerabilities getting more numerous or are they getting less numerous? Is the level of severity going up or down, right? So all of that stuff would be possibly a good control to have, right? So it takes you up to a higher level. Not required in the NIST baselines, but good ideas. Now, again, like I told you, a lot of the tools that are available out there have some of these items built into it, like the ability to do a trend analysis and the ability to look at previous scans. I know one of them that we use Qualys is one of the ones we use, and it has the ability when you run a scan again in the future, it will retest to see and verify that that vulnerability has been fixed, especially if you assign a vulnerability to be fixed to a staff member and they go into the Qualys management system and say that they've will run to actually check to verify that it has been fixed. So that's part of it, also doing that as well. So it actually has a ticketing system built into it. So again, that takes you to another level higher of more secure, less risk for your organization when it comes to vulnerabilities. Now the cybersecurity framework, NIST cybersecurity same framework, has a similar type of thing. Now these are objectives, they're not necessarily controls. So these are the things you should be doing. And again, I'm showing you this to show you that it's a requirement in almost nowhere, whether you fall under PCI, whether you fall under NIST, which is a good idea for everybody to follow, whether you're following the cybersecurity framework, no matter what you're following, it's required that you do vulnerability scanning. It's just, it's one of those things, it's like, back in the 90s, you used to tell people, oh, do you have antivirus? And people think, I don't really need it. And nowadays, everybody knows you need it, and it's just like common sense. You don't even have to justify it in a budget. Everybody knows you need to have antivirus. Well, vulnerability scanning is that way today, too. You just know you need to have it, and every standard requires it. So if you're not doing it, not a good idea. So ISO 27001 also requires that you manage your vulnerabilities, but notice that it doesn't perfectly match to RA5. So pen testing, there's no corresponding control, but they do talk about managing information security incidents and improvements, and it kind of fits under there. Normally, that's saying that you take, from quality assurance, you got hacked or your vulnerability left you exposed and somebody exploited it, and you found out about it, you learned about it, that you then take that information and you improve your program so that that doesn't happen again in the future. That idea of the quality assurance aspect of it, that is what you would put into what is being looked at in ISO here. So you can use a pen test as a way to do that. But it's also really just talking about actual live events that have happened. So both of them can kind of fit into there, but you can see that doesn't exactly fit what the other standards very clearly say that needs to be done. So it's there, but kind of not there. Anyways, now internal and external scans. I always get the questions about this from clients. You have a DM fee that you have set up, and the firewall is supposed to keep certain things out, right? So when we do a vulnerability scan, typically we'll run a scan, and then in this diagram that we show here, our scanners are outside on the internet, and they try to look in what a criminal may see if they ran a scan. And then we find that we see 10 vulnerabilities, let's say, right? Sometimes it's a lot more than that, but we find 10 vulnerabilities. Now, if we take our scanning device and we stick it into the DMZ, and we actually run a scan on the devices that are in there behind the firewall, we typically find considerably more vulnerabilities. And you may ask, well, why do you do that? Well, one reason is if I'm the organization that is hosting the DMZ and having all those servers in there, I want to know all the vulnerabilities I have. I don't want to know only the vulnerabilities that can be seen past the firewall. Because here's the thing, those 10 vulnerabilities, if any of them are able to be exploited, or another way that a hacker can get into your network past the firewall, if they're able to get past there, what are their actual vulnerabilities that they're going to be able to see and then try to exploit? That's what I want to know. So I want an internal scan. External scans are fine. I need to know what it looks like from the outside. So what does the rest of the world look at on the internet when they see my external system? But I also want to know what it looks like from the inside, because if they get past the firewall, and they can easily get past it, it's mind-bogglingly easy if you really want to get into someone's network. All you have to do for 90% result, higher than 90% results, is take a USB stick, put the logo of the company that you're trying to break into on that USB stick, put your code on it, drop it in the parking lot, and somebody is going to pick it up and stick it in their machine, right? And if they have code that is designed to get around anti-malware software, then they're going to be in. And then once they're in, what are they going to see? Because what hackers will do, and if we talked about this last time with pen testing, is they find a vulnerability, they exploit it, and then they what we call leapfrogging that we talked about in the last session. They find another system that has other vulnerabilities, and they keep on jumping around until they take over as many systems as they can. We call this sometimes advanced persistent threat. In other words, they get into the systems and they're in there for a while. The normal amount of time, or the average amount of time that an organization has the hackers in their network before they're discovered is like 6 months. So during that 6 months, those hackers are going in, they're scanning everything on the network, they're looking for other vulnerabilities, and they try to exploit as many of those machines inside of their devices that they can. And so they'll look for those IoT devices that you're not patching, and they'll put their code in there so that even if you discover them on the server that they first hacked into and you remove them from it, they're still inside your network because you don't realize they're still in your IoT devices. So this is why it is so important to doing those internal scans. You want to know what can be found in your network, and you want to make sure it's clean on the inside and that you don't have a lot of vulnerabilities. Internal or external scans, if someone asks me, I always say do both. And the difference between the two, you can kind of see, hopefully I've illustrated that for you. And if you have multiple network divisions and segmentation, you would need to do scans in each of those segmentations as well, or you should. Next one. Now, the idea of improvement should be a part of what we're trying to accomplish when we do scans. We're trying to get better over time. Most of my audit clients, because I do scans every year, they know they're coming, so they typically, each year, they get better. When I bring on a client that's brand new, they typically have terrible scan results. And then over the years, they get better and better and better and better. And I have very few that get worse over time. So the more mature your vulnerability management process is, in other words, the more scanning that you're doing, the automation that you put by it, that you actually have people that are mitigating and fixing those patches, the better your patch management process is, the better your configuration management process and change control processes are, the more mature you're going to be cybersecurity-wise, and the less risk your organization is going to have in having some type of incident, whether it be ransomware or whatever type of malicious code or data breach may happen to your organization. So you want to move up and be as mature as possible when it comes to dealing with vulnerabilities and the configurations that may be a part of those vulnerabilities, because that reduces your risk, right? So vulnerability scans, you find your vulnerabilities, prioritize which ones need to be fixed first, right? So we always look at the vulnerability scans and we say, okay, we have all these scans, we got 5,000 of them, there's too many of us to look at. Okay, let's get rid of all the low-level ones, the level 1s, level 2s, and level 3s. Let's just get rid of all those. And then let's just focus on, like if we're looking at a CVV score, anything that's 5 and above. Let's start with all the 9s and 10s, get rid of those, obviously, because they're the most vulnerable. Then I work our way down to the 8s, and I work our way down to the 7s. Now, in theory, that works really well, but you also kind of want to then prioritize it by the importance of the system that has the vulnerabilities. If I have a 10 on a system that's not really important, maybe it's a print server and it has a level 10 vulnerability, but I have a level 8 vulnerability on a financial application, I think I should probably fix the financial application vulnerability with an 8 before I do the 10 that's on the print server. Now, I want them both fixed, but I have to prioritize which ones I'm going to do first and kind of come up with a game plan as which ones I need to do first. So take those high important systems and get rid of the higher vulnerabilities on those first, then deal with the high vulnerabilities on the lower level systems or the lower priority systems, and then make sure that you start working your way down and getting rid of all those other vulnerabilities you find. So how can you improve the quality of your scan? So a lot of times people say, well, I'm doing a vulnerability scan and I'm not getting any better, so what am I doing wrong? Well, a vulnerability scan it's testing a couple of things. It's testing your patch management abilities, your configuration management abilities, and your change management. So those three processes, if you don't fix those processes, you're not necessarily going to get better vulnerability scan results. So you think about it, so how do we fix always having a lot of vulnerabilities? Well, let's start with the patch management process. Let's make sure that we patch everything as soon as possible. So that means we need to pay attention to when the vendors give us the patches, and we need to make sure they get deployed. And people will do a really good job on their Windows devices for this, not as well with their Linux, and really poorly apparently with their switches and routers and network devices. Every device needs to have patch management process, and one of the reasons for that is because Microsoft has free tools for the Windows environments, and so anytime you get outside of that, the free tools don't work anymore, and so you have to pay money to get other tools to kind of help with all the other devices. And sometimes those other patch management processes are really good about looking at the switches, routers, and the printers, and maybe even copiers, and look for their patches that need to be set in applications too. But then they may miss IoT devices. So your patch management process, there's no silver bullet. It's not an easy task, but this is what you got to work with, right? This has got to be a top priority, is making sure things are patched on a regular basis. Once you start that, your vulnerability scans will automatically start looking better right off the gate. Now, the other types of things is not every vulnerability that's going to be listed in a vulnerability scan is going to be a patch-related item. Some of them are going to be configuration-related, like I talked about SSL or SMB protocols. So making sure that you have a configuration process, and this gets into the change control too, come up with a baseline configuration for each of your devices, workstations, or servers. Test that, make sure that that is a good, solid baseline for a configuration. In other words, they're out there. Center for Internet Security, has a bunch of baselines that you can look at that can tell you how to set up your systems to lock them down, harden the system. And it has configuration baselines that you can do. And so you can put all of that together, make sure that you test it before you implement it. That's a part of the change management process, that it gets approved and gets tested before it gets put out. But once you have that set up in a patch management process, then your vulnerability scans are going to start coming out clean. So you're not going to have as many vulnerabilities in there. So what does a pen test do versus that for getting better results? Well, if you do a pen test, again, remember, we're looking to find and exploit vulnerabilities, and we want to test our ability to do incident response. So what we're trying to do to improve the quality for that, again, patch management, configuration management, and change management all going to be an important part of that, but incident response is also going to be improved in that, because we're going to take the lessons learned. Well, why didn't we catch these people when they were in our system? And we're going to also improve by making sure that we have intrusion detection. And intrusion detection / prevention is a huge, there's a lot of tools in that space there. Everything from log management systems that look at your logs to things that look at network traffic, all those types of things that kind of fit into that group. Putting those types of controls in is going to help make the pen test results better for your organization. All of that reduces the risk to your organization, right? So you want to do all those things as much as you possibly can. So some of the different, I put in here, and I'm not going to read them to you. You can read them yourselves if you want, download them and keep them if you want. But NIST 800-115 has an assessment guide that kind of tells you all the different types of assessments that you can do. And it talks a little bit about vulnerability scanning. So I put this information here. Again, you're not being tested on NIST's particular definitions of it, but I want to make sure that you at least knew what it was so that you can kind of, when you're in cybersecurity circles, you want to make sure we use definitions because we use them in a particular way so that other cybersecurity experts know. So NIST has a really good glossary available online, and it'll even tell you where there's different definitions, because sometimes different documents may have a different definition for something. So you can kind of take a look at those items as well. Now, I also recommend, and this is an old graphic, so don't pay attention to this graphic at all, because a lot of these devices aren't even available. Gartner did a test of different vulnerability scanners, and I think there's a couple other websites where people do tests of vulnerability scanners, and they compare the results. Now, one thing that's really difficult about comparing results is what their goal is in that vulnerability scanner. So, for example, this goes back about 10 years, so it may not necessarily be true today, and I'm not trying to say it's true today, but I'm just telling you, we did an evaluation where we used 3 different scanning devices, and we ran scans with those 3 different devices. And we found that the results between 2 of the scanners, let's say A and B, I was able to correlate this vulnerability was found on scanner A and on scanner B. Scanner C, however, grouped them in a different way and kind of took families of vulnerabilities and kind of rolled them up into one vulnerability. So while the other 2 almost had a 1-to-1 ratio, A and B had a 1-to-1 ratio, like one found 500 vulnerabilities, the other one found 502 vulnerabilities. We would go, the other scan only find 100, and we're like, why is this so wildly? So we had a really hard time actually trying to correlate. Was actually the one I'm talking about, C, was actually scanner C was actually used more as a pen tester's tool, and so it was giving up information and consolidating it so that somebody who was a human pen tester could kind of look at the results and say, okay, that group of vulnerabilities is really kind of one thing, and I'm just going to do one type of attack against it. So it's a good idea to actually look at the different scanners that are out there, look at what other people are using, how do they rate it. You want to get a really good one. Again, going back to the between A and B that I was talking about earlier, we found that like in one, let's say B would tell us you have weak authentication mechanisms for VPNs. Okay, that's helpful. Now, I don't know what that means. We actually had with the scanner A, it came back and said, you're using MS Chat version 2, and you should not be using that for authentication because it's weak. You should use EAP or one other type of mechanism. And so I found that the results for one of the scanners was more detailed than the other, right? So you kind of have to look at that. Also, you want to make sure the scanner gives you a report that also tells you how to fix the problem, right? Consider changing the configuration to this. That helps you out when doing that. So not all of them are created equal. You should kind of pay attention to them. And some of them get tested. Ones that I particularly like to go to are ones that PCI scanners use because they have to be tested every year. So if you go to a tool that is being used by what we call an ASV, approved scanning vendor, they have to be tested every year. And if they're not using that, then I'm less likely to use them. So just to think about that. Now, the vulnerability information, we kind of talked about it. They're available out there on the internet. There's a national vulnerability database and common vulnerabilities and exposures, so you can figure out what the CVE score is for different vulnerabilities. There's also a database of exploits. So if you are doing a scan and you're a pen tester, you can actually go in and they have tools that you can actually exploit those vulnerabilities. So if your pen tester does a lot of work for you, but the thing to know is, and I like this on the scanning device we use, it actually tells us if there is exploits available and where to get the exploits and who has the exploits. The reason why that's really important is because if there's a known exploit, that means the bad guys probably know it too. So that means that bad guys, we're easy pickings for them. So all of those types of vulnerabilities are ones that need to be fixed like ASAP. Now there's other types of things we have to talk about that fall under the CompTIA Security Plus, and that's passively testing security controls. Generally what we think of when we think of vulnerability scans are passive. They interact with the device by sending packets to it and looking at the responses. But they're not doing a bunch of stuff other than that. They're not actively engaging in the system typically. So that's what we mean by passively scanning systems and testing it, not interacting necessarily with it, light interacting and not doing it. Remember we talked about network traffic, passively observing it is one thing, and then, when you interact with a system, it's different. But what we want to be able to do with all this is identify what vulnerabilities we have. So scans hopefully can detect them. Now scans can't detect everything. And if we're doing it passively in a way where we're just interacting with the system anonymously, the system may say, hey, you're anonymous and I'm not going to let you have access to things. So another way that we like to, because what ends up happening is you can have what we call false positives. In other words, it'll say you don't have a vulnerability when you do, or it'll say you don't, or it'll say you have one when you don't. And that's because it's that passive mode where it's not actually logged into a system. So sometimes that's where this authenticated scan comes in. We actually use an authenticated scan to run against the device so we can log in with credentials and then actually get the device to actually tell us. So a lot of people don't know that there's a lot of vulnerability scans. There's a lot of false positives that kind of show up, especially if it's not an authenticated scan. So to reduce that, in other words, get better results, an authenticated scan will help us do that. So authenticated scans are really important if you have the ability to do them. So some of these can help you figure out if there's any lacking controls. We kind of talked about that. Obviously, if you run it with run it through a firewall, you're also kind of testing your firewall rules. You're seeing, if it's exposing information that it's not supposed to the internet. So you're testing other controls as well. You're also testing misconfigurations, which we already kind of covered, I think, pretty well earlier in this session, because that's one of the things we're looking for. That's the type of vulnerability that we may have. So finding those things is important, and then fixing those will also help us. So they talk about intrusive versus non-intrusive. Generally what they're talking about, in some scanning devices, you can tell them to be aggressive, and it can do like brute force password tests. So normally what it can do is do a passive one where it just scans to see that there's an authentication portal, and that's about as far as it goes. And an intrusive one, it may try different passwords to see if it can get into anything. And it may try 5 different passwords and then give up if it doesn't work. It generally does that because you don't want to lock a system out. Because if after 5 attempts your system's going to lock it out, then you may end up locking a system out and you didn't mean to do that. So that's a part of why if we do an intrusive one, we may put a limit on it. Whereas a pen test may go until they lock the system out. But a vulnerability scan, we don't want it to bring down systems. We kind of already talked about this, credentials versus non-credentials. The thing to remember, credentials means we give it credentials. We're giving it a username and a password that is on the system so the vulnerability scanner can log in as a user on the system and then actually get more accurate results, especially results. Now you'll say, hey, the bad guys aren't going to see it this way. Well, great. That's what a pen test is for. A vulnerability scan is for us to find out all of our holes are. So I definitely want to do a credentialed one because I want to know precisely what vulnerabilities our systems have so we can fix them. Non-credential scans are fine, but they're not as accurate. So if accuracy is more important for you, then you want to go to the credentials. Now some people say, well, should I start with credentialed or non-credentialed? It kind of depends. I know a lot of organizations just start with the non-credentials, try to fix everything there, and then move to the credentials. I find that most people end up, when they get to the credentialed side, they just stick to it. So I don't know, maybe it makes more sense to just start with credentials and stay that way. So it also kind of depends upon who you are. If I'm the auditor and I come in, they usually don't give me credentials to do the scan, so I'm typically doing a non-credentialed scan, unless we're doing a special assessment where we do credentialed scans. We false positives, and that's where the credentials can really help. It's just those vulnerability scans aren't perfect. Like I told you, sometimes the level of accuracy even within it, they found the vulnerability, but the level of accuracy of what that vulnerability is different, and that could end up being a false positive as well. So to kind of combat those types of things, sometimes what you have to do is you assign those tasks to be fixed to a system admin. System admin goes and looks at the system and says, okay, this vulnerability, how do I fix it? And then hopefully the report tells you how to fix it. Then you go in, you apply the patch, you change the configuration, you test it, make sure everything's working, then do a new scan to make sure that the vulnerability still doesn't exist, right? And sometimes it's just hard to get rid of vulnerabilities. A good example of a vulnerability you can't get rid of is obsolete software. Obsolete software pops up, and our vulnerability scanners, if we catch obsolete software, in other words, software that's no longer supported by the vendor, it's going to pop it as a high result because the vendor's not supporting it anymore. There's no more patches for it. Nobody's tracking any vulnerabilities for it, so it's obsolete, and that leaves you to a level of unknown risk, right? At least if you have a new system that's patched and up to date, you kind of have an idea of what your level of risk is, but you have no idea when it's an obsolete system because nobody's tracking it anymore. So bad guys could have, all kinds of hacks and exploits for those older operating systems or applications. So it's vitally important to make sure that you get rid of those if you have them. Configuration baselines. You can also do scanning for configuration baseline. Now this gets a little bit outside of the vulnerability side of things, but I kind of don't think it is. And this is why. Have a configuration baseline. If it's outside of that baseline, whatever you came up with, you want to know about it, right? So if you set everything to be using TLS and not SSL, if all of a sudden it's using SSL, you want to know it. Someone changed something, or this happens all the time, you do a patch on the system, and that patch then enables something that you had turned off. So that changed the configuration. You want to know that that has happened so that you can fix it, because that can lead to a new vulnerability. So part of your vulnerability management process needs to make sure that we're looking at the configuration all the time. Anytime you change or anything like that, it needs to be tested again. So sometimes you just run a test against one IP. You do all the patching to it. You run a scan against it, and you just determine whether or not it's fixed. And this brings me to another point, because you can do your vulnerability scanning any way you want to do them. A lot of people do do a whole entire subnet at one time, and that's great because you can discover different things that may be missing in your inventory. But another good idea too is just to scan one device, one scan, figure out what all its problems are, get all its configurations set to the way it's supposed to be, and then scan it again. You keep on doing just that one device until that, whatever it is, server, workstation, whatever it is, fixed. If you have a configuration, then take that configuration and then apply it to everybody else. So that becomes then like your test bed. You have a test bed, you do your vulnerability scanning, you do that as a part of your testing to figure out what your configuration baseline should be, let's say on your workstation. Then once you scan it, you've got really good results with that one. Then you take that configuration baseline that you have and apply it to all the other ones. Then you run a scan on all the other ones. And then hopefully they all come up with the same results that the test one had. So doing testing is really important as a part of this, and vulnerability scanning is usually a part of that testing when we change anything like a configuration baseline or anything. And then we confirm when we push it out there. Another type of one that kind of fits into this kind of category but doesn't really is file integrity scanning. So a lot of them will do that type of scanning. Usually those require agents. In other words, there has to be some kind of code that's on the system in order to look at it, because they're typically looking at important system files to make sure that nobody is messed with those files. Like if you've installed SQL database and you want to make sure that the SQL.exe file has not been changed, that's what you want to make sure that the file has its integrity. No one's changed it. No one's done anything to it. So file integrity scanning could be a part of that. It's not necessarily considered vulnerability scanning. It's more like intrusion detection type of scanning. But I threw it in here because oftentimes it's side by side with configuration scanning. And configuration scanning kind of gets into the vulnerability side. So I'm getting off into the weeds, but I wanted to tell you about it. So you may not necessarily see this come up on the Security Plus exam, but if you're doing any payment applications, file integrity scanning is going to be an important part of it because it's required for that. If you do a file integrity scan and a file is changed and it's a system file, it could be an indication of a compromised system. So this is also a good incident response input, right? So you come up with file integrity scan, comes up with some results saying that something's been modified, then this should indicate a change. Okay, what's the history of this system? So you want to be able to look at the maintenance record and say, hey, did we apply a patch to this? Did we make any system change? Who was the last person to touch this machine, to find out why and no patches or anything have been made to it? Then that's definitely an indication that there's probably a compromise there, or somebody has tried to get into the system. So then that would then indicate doing some type of forensic results or doing another type of scan to see if there's any malicious code on there or something that's not supposed to be in there, looking for hidden processes, and doing threat hunting, basically. So that kind of moves you into different areas. And hopefully, my little exercise of kind of telling you how this all works together can kind of show you how all these different security controls we talk about are like cogs in a wheel. Like one cog turns, another one turns, and it's all different life cycles within IT that you have that all work together. And when they work together, you go from, hey, I'm doing this vulnerability scans, I make sure the files are integrity. Oh, we have results from this. What is it an indication of? Possible compromise. Let's determine if it is a compromise. Oh, it looks like it could be. Okay, let's get forensics involved. Incident response team gets involved, and then you start the whole incident response process. Containment, eradication, all that kind of stuff that you then, as evidence preservation. That gets into a whole nother life cycle, right? So you go from one to the other, and hopefully, if everything is, I want to say greased up really well, I guess, if everything's working smoothly and flows well, you will be able to respond to incidents and improve the overall security of your organization. So that's where vulnerability scans can kind of fit into that, and they're vitally important, so much so that this is like one of the main things that CompTIA puts into their Security Plus certification, because they want you to know what the benefit of doing vulnerability scans are, what are the different options, and what is it that you're trying to actually accomplish, and what are some of the processes involved in it. And that's our session. Please leave us some feedback. Please rate us. Working together, we can help make the world cyber safe. Just want to let you know that, and that's kind of what our motto is here. And to keep the lights on, pay for this channel, all this, Mason Associates has some cybersecurity services that are available. You can check those out. That's much of an ad that we do on this. And remember to subscribe to our channel. And then if you need to contact us, again, go to our blog, learnsecurity.org. You can send us a message. If there's any topics you want us to cover in the future or any other suggestions or comments, just go ahead and leave them there, and we'll get back to you. With that, if there are no questions, I don't see any questions from the audience, so thank you very much and have a good day.